Now, it is my honor to introduce our next session, where Ms. Marina Kaljurand will sit down with Mike Schmidt to have a conversation on cyber operations and the gray zones of international law. Ms. Marina Kaljurand is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Estonia, the chair of the newly established Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. She has been appointed as ambassador of Estonia to several countries, including the US and Russia. And she has also been twice as the national expert to the UNGG, which deals with top-level discussions on international cybersecurity. And then we have Professor Dr. Mike Schmidt, who is the director of the Tallinn Manual, and the Tallinn Manual will be the focus of this discussion. He was the managing editor, and he's also a senior fellow at the NATO CCD-COE. Among the many titles he holds, he serves as the professor of international law at the Exeter Law School, at the United States Naval War College, and the US Military Academy at West Point. So the floor is yours, and have a fruitful conversation.
Well, thank you, Henry. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's the second time I listened to Katie, and I had a question, but I didn't want to jeopardize the time, so I'll ask it later. But it's always very difficult to take the stage after you. So, Mike, we have to do our best. And I'd like to add one more thing when introducing Mike. I think that one important thing is that this year you were awarded the greatest honor of Estonia given to a foreigner. It's the Order of Terra Mariana. So, Mike, congratulations on your efforts.
Thanks.
I know Mike for years. We've been in the same panels. We've discussed several topics. There are many things I like about you.
But?
I was just wondering, and I can't say anything, name anything I don't like about you.
Oh,
but
God.
What is the thing? Mike has the ability to explain the most difficult questions of international law, of international case law, in a simple way, so that even lawyers understand you. Not speaking about non-lawyers. So we have a great privilege of having you, and I have lots of questions. I don't see anybody. I see only the first row. So please, if you have questions to Mike, try to raise your hand, and Henry or somebody will try to find those with raised hands. But we'll start with, and on a personal note, it's the first time I'm interviewing somebody. I'm thrilled, I'm nervous, and I'm waiting for job offers after that. If not from CNN, then at least from Estonian National Broadcast. And I hope to interview the next time Katie. But coming to the topic, why we're here today. This is the book. Yes, Mike is a happy co-parent, or I should even say godfather, of the Tallinn Manual 2.0. which was published at the beginning of this year, 598 pages of legal text.
How terrible.
So besides congratulations, I would like to start with the basic. Mike, what, why, for whom?
Well, it all started in your country with the NATO CCD, the attacks, of course, in 2007, and then cyber operations during the international armed conflict between Russia and Georgia in 2008, focused attention. NATO decided to take a look at the NATO CCD-COE, decided to take a look at the international law, and asked me to put together a team. We came here, we had very modest expectations. Initially, we only wanted to do international humanitarian law. We were asked to look more broadly at what is known as the jus ad bellum, the law governing the use of force, self-defense, and so forth. And so we pulled together a team. We were criticized for the team because the team consisted of FOMs, friends of Mike. I called smart people and brought them here. It was not a geographically diverse team, which resulted in some criticism and a change in the program later on. We looked at those two bodies of law, IHL and the use of force. It was somewhat successful, so the CCD-COE asked us to keep going. And that's Tallinn 2.0, because in Tallinn 2.0, we addressed the peacetime legal regime. So human rights law, sovereignty jurisdiction, space law, law of the sea, and so forth. And so we wanted a comprehensive guide to understanding international law in the context of cyber. I will tell you, at the time we started, perhaps the reason why we started is because states were still struggling with the concept of whether or not international law even applied to this new domain. The group that we brought together in about 14 seconds decided that the notion that international law did not apply to cyberspace was, I'll use a new Estonian word, kovfefe, okay, kovfefe. So we quickly moved into how the law applied. So what this book is a book done by two groups of experts, one a very NATO-focused group of experts, and the second a very international group of experts, Belarus, China, Thailand, Canada, and so forth. It's their view on how international law applies in cyberspace. Perhaps what's most important in the book is where the experts did not come to agreement. Because where we did not come to agreement, we worked diligently to express all the possible options so that folks like yourself working in the GGE or for governments know where to focus their effort. Where are, the title is, where are the gray areas? Who is it for? It's a complex book. I have to tell you, it's hard reading. So it's primarily for legal advisors at MODs, MFAs, intelligence organizations, and so forth. We hope the academic community benefits from it. We hope the policy community can wade through the legal text, but it's really for legal advisors who are advising people like you.
Well, thanks, Mike, and I absolutely agree with you. Even the experts of international law can't write international law, can't apply international law. It has to be done by states, by governments.
Right.
So, which means that now we're looking at whom? Legal advisors, at the MFAs, MODs, to look into the book and to start interpreting it, to start applying it. You very rightly said that we have agreed that international law applies to cyber, but the question remains how? You mentioned gray zones, Katie called them laws with bugs, and you wrote a very good article about the gray zones in the international law of cyberspace for the Yale Journal of International Law online. And there you said at the very beginning that Russia is pretty smart in taking advantage of the gray zones in Ukraine, in Crimea, but also with the hacking of the servers of DNC. Right. Could you say a bit more on that?
So, yeah, I have to applaud the international lawyers in Russia working for the Russian government, because what they've very cleverly done is figure out where there's international law that is not quite clear. And then they operate within this zone. And they operate within this zone for two reasons. The first is when they operate in this unclear, this gray area of international law, it makes it hard to criticize them, to condemn their activities, to get consensus in the international community that what they've done is wrong. It's the first benefit. The second benefit is it complicates the response option, because the responses that target states can take depend on the legal character of the action taken against them. So, for example, if there's been a breach of sovereignty, this opens the door to what are called countermeasures, which in lay terms would be a hack back. So let's take the DNC hack. The DNC hack, in my view, was a violation of US sovereignty because it interfered with what a lawyer would call an inherently governmental function, picking your own leadership. I also believe it was a violation of the prohibition on intervention because it manipulated an election process. But I'll tell you, there's disagreement from people I respect deeply on both of these points, that the Russian actions may not quite have qualified as these two violations. And what that meant was that if they weren't clearly violations of international law, then countermeasures were not available to the United States, because countermeasures, it's a legal term referring to an act that would be unlawful, but for the fact you're trying to get the other side to knock it off. The United States, because of the lack of clarity, was limited to, expelling diplomats and imposing sanctions, which you can do for any reason or no reason at all in international law. And so they cleverly operate within this gray zone, both to avoid condemnation and also to limit the responses that the other side. I pick on the Russians because they did this in the Ukraine, in the non-kinetic, in the kinetic environment. Remember the little green men. As we struggled to determine whether the little green men were really Russian soldiers, that complicated our assessment of whether or not Russia was at war as a matter of law with the Ukraine, and whether Russia had violated Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force. The Russians and other states are engaging in my view, what is asymmetrical lawfare. And the reason is because they like the gray zone, because it allows them to do things that are questionable. Our countries, Estonia, the United States, much of the West, we don't like operating in the gray zone because we're committed to the rule of law. So they exploit it, and then we hesitate to react. And we hesitate to react in part because if we do react in the gray area, what they're going to do is then say, aha, you violated international law yourself. So it's a very fascinating dynamic that we're observing.
Mike, continuing on what you said, another question, I think, which is very topical, which has been discussed in the framework of the traditional international law and application of international law, is the responsibility of a state. Responsibility of a state for the acts of a non-state actor. Lots of questions in international law. How to connect non-state actors to the state. How to attribute the acts, wrongful acts, to the state. In cyber, it's even more complicated. Very simply, where do you see the threshold is, or how would you evaluate when state could be responsible and should be responsible for the acts of non-state actors?
Wow, what a great question, because this is a really gray zone, and we will see states operate within this zone actively. The legal standard for attribution is that you can attribute an action to another state if it is reasonable to conclude the other state was connected. So the standard of certainty is reasonableness, not correctness. States always must act reasonably. They need not always be correct. But that's the standard of proof, if you will. The legal standard for attribution, developed by a group called the International Law Commission in a project that lasted half a century, is that the state must instruct, go do this, or director control, a term that lawyers now call effective control, which means if you're a non-state actor and I'm a state, it means I can tell you what to do or what not to do. I'm your boss. So I either tell you to go do this, and maybe I give you a contract to do it, or I exercise such authority over you that when I pick up the phone and call you, you're going to go do what I tell you to do. Now, this begs the question of exactly what does that control mean? If I'm providing funding to you, and if I'm providing material support to you, and you could not operate your operations without that funding or material support, well, is that effective control? Well, I don't know the answer to that question. Or if I'm providing you sanctuary in my state that enables you to operate, is the fact that if I expel you from my state, is that degree of control, is that effective control? Well, when the Americans took on the Taliban in Afghanistan, we took that position, but many states disagreed that sanctuary is sufficient to attribute. So again, we have this, we lawyers can tell the policymakers the standard is effective control, but we leave it to the policymakers to determine how they wish to interpret this as a matter of their own national policy and national interests.
I think for the first time, at least my country, had to look very seriously into the question of attribution in 2007. I was then Estonian ambassador to Russia, which means that my obligation was to try to cooperate with the other side to find those bad guys who were behind their attacks. the attribution was difficult. I can't say that we looked very much into international law then. At least we didn't start interpreting immediately the provisions of responsible state behavior or any of those provisions. It was more common sense that guided us. And when we attributed it to a specific country, then the logic was, and here I'm going to quote the Minister of Defense of that time, if somebody looks like a dog, behaves like a dog, barks like a dog, then most probably that's a dog. Or maybe in our case, a bear is the better way to say. But now, are you ready to attribute some of being a lawyer, advising, let's say, government? Are you ready to attribute some of the recent cyber operations, cyber attacks to specific countries?
Sure. Russia, China, absolutely. Again, the conclusion must be reasonable. Of course, every conclusion is fact-specific. So a good lawyer working with a policymaker, a decision maker will say, show me the beef. Where's the beef? So you ask them to come in and provide you all the evidence. But the standard of attribution is, looks like a bear, smells like a bear, walks like, it is. That is in fact, because that means you're acting reasonably as a matter of law. So I think, given what I know, I believe attribution to Russia, for example, with respect to the hacks, clearly the case. North Korea, Sony, clearly the case. And remember, attribution is not just for non-state actors. Attribution is for the organs of the state. Intelligence organs, either de jure or de facto organs of the state. I think it's pretty easy to do that. And by the way, attribution to the United States and with regard to certain operations as well.
What would be your advice to governments? Because attribution has always the political layer. The political layer is there. Even if it's technically attributed, then politicians step in. And sometimes it's difficult to blame or point at somebody because it immediately creates action from that, reaction back from that state, from that non-state actor, and so on. So how can we get state practice showing how international law applies, how attribution applies, if states, for political reasons, are not willing to go to the end of the path?
Well, if they're not willing to go to the end of the path, they have to live with the consequences of their unwillingness to do so. Until you go to the end of the path, until you engage in state practice, until you, what lawyers would call, make expressions of opinio juris. It means your legal opinion as to the character of the act. Until you do that, you'll have to live with the uncertainty. And that's very, very problematic. I understand that many people say ambiguity as to the legal norms. That ambiguity is useful to a state because it gives states room to maneuver. But what we must begin to grasp is the fact that it gives your opponents room to maneuver as well, because in international law there is a principle called sovereign equality. There's some degree of difference between your country and mine, but not as a matter of law. But not as a matter of law. You have the same rights and obligations that the United States does. So if states are going to continue to openly attribute based on a reasonable conclusion, not an absolute conclusion, then they're going to have to live with the consequences of uncertainty in international law. And in my view, that's problematic. And I believe that states need to do more than say they did it. What states need to say, what's more important, is that when they say they did it, they say, and in doing so, they violated the prohibition on intervention. In doing so, they violated our sovereignty, and this is why, because we believe sovereignty, and that's the missing element. The missing element is, what is it they have done? I would have been delighted had the United States come out and said, the Russians did it, and that was a violation of our sovereignty because it interfered with an inherently governmental function in every country of the world, running elections. But, we didn't do it, so we lost the opportunity to start to build the normative structures. Law professors don't make international law. States make international law, so they got to start doing it. They got to start making it.
As Henry said, I'm representing Estonia in the UN group of experts on cybersecurity, and I can say that what you're saying, theoretically, I understand everything. In practical terms, very, very difficult.
Absolutely.
Because the same ideological battle we have in real life is also in cyber. The questions we can't agree on in international law in real life, we can't agree online. So it's difficult. But I absolutely agree with you that we need norms, we need rules, we need to understand what is expected from a state to if we want a state to be responsible.
So I think I believe trying to hammer out agreed upon norms, consensus norms of international law or simply of conduct, best practice and so forth, in multinational fora is the best way to do it, and it's also the hardest way to do it. Because everyone comes to the table from a different perspective. What you see in life depends on where you stand. But that doesn't relieve individual states of seizing the opportunity to themselves, because international law can be clarified not only in multinational fora, but by building a crescendo of states to say, no, we believe there is a principle of sovereignty, and this is what it is. And I have to tell you, for countries that come from, or from folks that come from small countries like yours, you have the greatest advantage here. Because here, despite the size of an Estonia, or we were recently doing capacity building in Chile, and I was speaking to government officials there, small countries, and I see my congressman from Rhode Island is here. I come from Rhode Island, which is a small state. But in the United States, we wield great power because we're able to operate with greater flexibility than the big states, where you often have these competing concerns. So what I imagine is that we will continue to go slow in multinational fora. Individual states, they will be states like Estonia, states like the Netherlands, will take the lead and begin to articulate what they believe the law to be. And in any negotiation, always come with the straw man, make them talk about your proposal. And then these small states, in particular yours in the Netherlands, Netherlands is engaged in a process called the Hague process to do this. These states will be the ones that build the normative architecture for the future.
I think it's very fair that you're mentioning Netherlands, because I also should have said that Netherlands was the country that was also helping to finance the project, and Netherlands has always been very active
Absolutely.
on international law. But again, for small states, international law has very much other meaning than maybe for some big states. For small states, international law is a guardian.
Right.
It's the safeguard. Big states can choose, can pick some norms, can change others. That's the real life.
That's why the small states have to take the lead.
And to be more vocal. Are there any questions from the audience? If not, I'll continue. But please think about questions. You have Professor Mike Schmidt, who explains everything so easily, even for there's already a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, right. Hi, good morning, Professor Robert Dewar from the Centre for Security Studies, ETH Zurich. I have slightly more of I suppose, an academic conceptual question. There is a debate about whether, leading on from your point about certain larger states have the capacity to pick and choose which norms they choose to apply, that leads to a certain academic question on the applicability and even the validity of international law. From a realist perspective, there is no higher authority than a sovereign state, so how can international law actually be valid and be applied? That being said, is there a case for arguing that in cyberspace, or the cyber domain, is really the one domain where international law can truly apply, given the architecture of the internet, the manner in which data flows through cables, etc.? It is a truly international, non-regional domain, therefore international law can most effectively apply there.
So, it is because I will tell the story on myself. So when I started this project, I knew a wee bit about international law, but I sure as heck didn't know much about technology. And we were accompanied by great people, Ryan Otis and is in the audience and some others that were trying to explain it to us. And I did not even at the time have a cell phone at all. So they kept talking about a cloud, the cloud this, the cloud that, blah, 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 the cloud. And I swear to God on a stack of Bibles that I kind of thought the cloud, Marina's heard this before, I swear, I kind of thought the cloud was like up there. You know, kind of, I wasn't stupid enough to believe it was an actual cloud floating around, but sort of up there, you know? And as a result of that, I was, to some degree, sensitive to the viewpoint that, you know, international law isn't going to apply in the same way. This is going to be a real uphill battle. But eventually, Ryan and the other technical experts explained that the cloud it's not up there, you bonehead. It's down here. It's all this stuff. And there are cables connecting it. This was like a juridical epiphany to me because it meant that the principle of sovereignty applied. So because a cable sits on the ocean floor, it is subject to the law of the sea. Because a server and a router and an iPad sit in a country, it is subject to the sovereignty of that country, and the individual that operates it is subject to the prescriptive and the enforcement and the juridical sovereignty jurisdiction of that country. So when people tell me about this uniqueness and international law is going to apply differently, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. If Sven has a computer on his lap, that computer is treated in the same way as the chair he is sitting on with regard to sovereignty, jurisdiction, and so forth. So I really believe that many, many people have made it very, very hard to understand the applicability of international law. Now, as we've been discussing, wow, when you start figuring out precisely how it applies, now we have an uphill battle. You know, if we take sovereignty for an example, there is a current theory that sovereignty doesn't apply in cyberspace. It's a nonsensical theory. There are some articles coming out on it. I wrote one with an Estonian, Liis Vihul, that will be published soon. But it is a fair question to say, when is there a violation of sovereignty? Well, clearly there's a violation of sovereignty if you interfere with inherently governmental acts. Clearly there's a violation of a state's sovereignty if you're operating on the state's territory and engaging in cyber operations, because they don't consent to those operations. Clearly there's a violation of sovereignty if you have remote operations conducted into a state that are destructive or that interfere in a permanent way with the functionality of cyber infrastructure. But what if you embed malware? What about back doors? What about a DDoS operation that is fairly extended in time? Are these violations of sovereignty? I don't know the answer to that question. And neither did the Tallinn manual experts. We are looking to states to come out and say, with respect to this activity, which we attribute to another state, and it's that state, we believe this was a violation of our sovereignty. It is only when states begin to do this that we'll start to see these gray zones become black and white. And I would emphasize this cannot be left to the academic community. Okay? The academic community does good work. I like to think we did okay work here. But states and only states make and interpret international law. So, you know, with respect to the legal advisors in the audience and the policymakers, ladies and gentlemen, it's time you got to step up. You know, you got a job to do, start doing it. But I don't feel strongly about this.
It's so easy to say, and it's so difficult to do. Because when you explain it, it's so logical. I understand every step. But now let's become practical. With the number of attacks we have every day, let's say MFA in our networks. I'm not going to say the number, but it's huge.
Right.
When is the violation of the sovereignty if they're coming from a remote territory? When the malware is implanted? When information is being extracted? when something disturbing happens. When it's destruction and fatal results, I understand. But the easier cases, when should we react?
So,
what should be there?
This is my whole point. States have got to quit waiting for someone to tell them the answer, because they and they alone have the answer. So we'll take Estonia. You know, I love Estonia. I would be delighted if Estonia started saying, because Estonia punches way, way, way above its weight in the cyber context, if Estonia started saying that operation from a non-state actor in Russia was a violation of our sovereignty. Because, so you have to decide what's in your national interest with regard to that interpretation. Again, I know it's hard, but states, and it's not your state, it's all the states, they're waiting for someone to answer the question. They're waiting for Kubo Machak, who's a great scholar from Exeter. They're waiting for Kubo to give them the answer. Kubo doesn't have the answer. Your legal advisor does. You have to sit around the table with the legal advisors and the policy makers and the decision makers and say, let's make this call. Only then will law move ahead. Now, what I will have to say is, although I express it in simple terms, this is really complicated stuff. You don't go to a legal advisor who's a general practitioner. You go to a legal advisor who's a brain surgeon. This is very, very complicated law. And it's complicated because it cuts across all sorts of bodies of law. So we have the Naval Academy here. They probably know the law of sea really well, but I don't know that they know international human rights law. I suspect they don't, okay? Because in Europe they know international human rights. It's complicated. So states have got to start building legal capacity to play in this complex morass of rules. They have to, I applaud the Dutch again. The Dutch have a capacity building program for attorneys and policymakers who work in the field. They've just collaborated with the Republic of Chile, the Netherlands, and Canada to do a capacity building course in Latin America. Yeah. We just here at the CCD last week ran a course primarily for NATO PFP countries. We will go to the UK soon to the Defence Academy at Shrivenham to run it for British military and civilian. You can't just look to the old legal advisor that told you where to sign on the dotted line. Complicated stuff, build the capacity, and then once you understand, you got to start making the call. You got to make the tough calls.
Agree with that. And that's something I've been also saying here in Estonia, in other countries, that the interpretation is needed. But it's so easy for you to say, you write what you want, 600 pages. If our legal advisor writes 6 sentences, it has immediately consequences.
Right.
But we will do it. Mike, another question I'd like to ask. There are so many initiatives today about creating new international law, pieces of international law. Russia is talking about code of conduct. Microsoft is talking about Geneva Conventions. What's your view on that?
Well, I'm skeptical because I'm an international lawyer and I know that it's very, 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 very difficult to make treaties. It's difficult to craft the treaties. It's difficult to get states to become party to the treaties. So, you know, these are noble endeavors, and I support them in principle. You know, Geneva Convention for Peacetime in Cyberspace, it's a very creative and clever principle, but as an international lawyer, I would say to these folks, you need a dose of reality therapy. It ain't that easy. You don't put up a website and have a kumbaya conference where everyone agrees that this is needed. It's hard, hard, hard work. So I support them in principle, but I really do believe it's for individual states or regional groupings of states that have shared values and interests to begin to move the ball forward. But I applaud the effort. I applaud the effort because it's like the GGE. You were the instrumental person in the GGE. The GG did move the ball forward. Every morning I wake up and I read your 2015 report. I did this morning, as I always do. And you know, I read it and said, this is a really important document. This talks about the concept of due diligence. This talks about the sovereign quality of states. This talks about the legal principle of the peaceful settlement of disputes, which is a very important one. It talks about international human rights law, and it alludes, doesn't talk directly about it, but it alludes to international humanitarian law in cyberspace. That's very, very important. So I applaud these efforts, but it's time to take the next step. We need to begin to add granularity to our understanding of the norms. To say that international human rights law applies in cyberspace I absolutely believe it. But we need to understand, but what does it mean with respect to the international human right, I believe there is one in customary law, of expression or of privacy? And you know, only states are going to answer that, in my view.
It was so encouraging to hear that you read every morning the report of 2015.
I was so delighted when you issued the 2015 report, so I could quit reading the 2013 report every morning.
Because for those who haven't read it, it's really confusing. Even us who wrote it don't understand completely what we said. But stay tuned. In a month, I very much hope we will have a new report, which means that you have something new to read. But fingers crossed, there are still a couple of weeks to go. And on this positive note, there is one last question, please.
Apologize for cutting off the end of the panel. My name is Patrick Muldray, Cyber Intelligence at FireEye. We follow a number of cyber threat actors who compromise businesses, infrastructure in other countries in order to conduct operations and maintain deniability and so on. What does the GG report and the Tallinn manual say about this, and what is the current state of state practice, if you looked at it all, in responding to these kind of allegations? Many countries have put it in their intelligence reports that this is a problem, including most recently Finland that I read. Have you seen a lot of activity on the state front on this in terms of botnet takedowns or international legal cooperation of that kind? Thanks.
No. You're the star.
Okay. The answer is, no, I don't know much about the state practice in that regard. I mean, the law is pretty clear. You have to, in order to get what's called an internationally wrongful act, you have to get two things. You have to get a breach of an international law rule, what's called a primary rule of international law. In this case, that rule would be sovereignty. And that's why I've focused so much on getting greater clarity on sovereignty, because it's very difficult to get that hurdle if you don't know what sovereignty is. The second thing is attribution. We've explained a second ago what the attribution is. If it's an organ of a state, then it's attributable. And if it's instructions, direction, or control, then it is attributable. I haven't seen, but I haven't done a deep scrub. You would know better than me, state practice in this regard. The law, the logical process of deconstructing it from an international is pretty clear. Again, there's gray on how to apply the specific norms. The state practice, I don't know what the state practice is with any depth. I will tell you, though, it's a very, very, very good question, because state practice is the key. You see, these norms will not develop unless you either see state practice or comments by states in a somewhat official capacity as to the character of these norms. So until we begin to see that, and I understand state practice is hard because of classifications, until we start to see that, I don't think anyone's going to have a good answer to the normative aspect of your question.
Well, Mike, look at his face. He wants us to leave the stage. That's
he wants
the bad
to
news.
feed us.
We'll continue the corridor. The good news is we'll get some chocolate.
Yes.
So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause to Professor Mike Schmidt.
And to you.
And an applause to... Thank you.
It's an uncomfortable chair. Thanks.